All right, we're recording.
All right. So this is a review for the Period 4 APUSH DBQ, which centers on domestic issues from, it says here, 1945 to 1970, but I believe the year on the classroom was 1940. So that's what I'm going to start with. Right. So if you get to the first slide.
Yeah, I'm
So by 1940, under FDR's leadership and the implementation of what's called Keynesian economics, which is sort of the general philosophy that government intervention and government spending is needed to prime the pumps of the national economy and to foster growth and recovery from economic crises. The United States was on a steady but still very slow recovery from the Great Depression. A year earlier, the war in Europe had broken out, and by 1940, Nazi Germany was approaching the zenith of its power. France fell in June of 1940, and by the end of 1940, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands were all occupied. And so at this point, globally, there was greater Allied pressure, particularly from British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to lean on FDR to give support to the Allies. FDR personally was of the opinion that America should at least offer military aid to the Allied powers, but at this point, the American population was still fiercely isolationist after World War I and the Great Depression, and so it took significant political effort to even commit military aid via the Lend-Lease program, in which weapons were shipped off under the pretext that there would be a certain repayment later. Ultimately, though, on December 7th, 1941, on, as FDR famously said, a day that shall live in infamy, if he wanted to use that quote, should this be, a relevant prompt, Pearl Harbor was bombed, which led to a national outcry and the necessary political climate for war to be declared on Japan and then later Nazi Germany. The war industrial complex, or essentially the wartime economy and industrialization for military production and the administration of the war, produced an economic miracle within the United States that propelled it to superpower status and by war's end the uncontested predominant economic power of the world. So that's sort of America's standing as the Second World War came to a close. The American people enjoyed a general sense of economic prosperity and general stability throughout the 1950s, which was sort of the Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower administrations. And there was also popular support for taking a new role in international affairs to ensure that this new peace would last and to ensure that that Europe would get back on its feet. So in 1948, there was the formation of the United Nations, which America would join and become a permanent member of the Security Council. And America also initiated certain economic aid programs in Europe, like the Marshall Plan, to help assist the war-torn nations of Europe. And this is sort of generally at that point, it's all right, you can skip to the next slide. Generally at this point, you can see more of a shift to a more liberal age, but we'll talk about that in a second. Now, if the prompt is more centered around the civil rights movement, some information surrounding the civil rights movement more broadly. There was a renewed push globally following the end of World War II for the establishment of a new, more morally righteous and peaceful era than there ever was before. There was a renewed sort of moral awakening, perhaps akin to earlier progressive revolutions in the early 1900s and such. Internationally, the United States was one of the last sort of first world countries that still had systemic segregation, and this became a source of national embarrassment during such times as the Olympics. In 1968, obviously, segregation was nominally removed through legislation by that point, but there's the famous Black Power salute, if you are aware of that. That was an instance when two track runners, after winning medals, put their head down and threw up their fist during the Pledge of Allegiance, during the U.S. national anthem in support of the Black Power movement. Figures like Rosa Parks, going back though, with her famous sit-in on the bus in 1955 sparked a new age of civil rights activism that differed from the more low-profile tactics of the NAACP. Now, new leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. forced the issues of segregation and systemic racism into the minds and hearts of everyday Americans. Through as many organized marches and peaceful protests, this sort of civil disobedience was a new kind of activism that sort of forced the issue in a way that did not cast the efforts into sort of a negative light through any sort of violence or controversy. And so ultimately they were successful in producing certain legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the 1960s and 70s, writing off the prosperity of the prior decade, there was also a greater wave of liberalism and increased government spending and intervention for the welfare of the people. A part of this could be seen as cause for the election of JFK, which was the nation's first Irish Catholic and the youngest president. Moving forward into sort of the later part of this time period, more the 60s and the 70s, JFK was assassinated in 1963. This was national shock, and coupled with the assassination of Martin Luther King 5 years later, along with John F. Kennedy's brother Robert Kennedy, this contributed to a period of greater strife and popular unrest. The key source of this unrest being increasing Black skepticism and increasingly violent demonstrations from civil rights activists as part of new groups like the Black Panthers, who sort of cried out at the shortcomings of the civil rights legislation, which nominally did abolish many aspects of the Jim Crow era as it was known, but there were still, of course, many cultural aspects of civil rights that were still far from coming. And so this sparks renewed protests and such acts as the Black Power salute in the Olympics, as was talked about in the previous slide. The LBJ administration, which was during the 60s and into the 70s, somewhat carried the zenith of this progressive wave. His famous Great Society legislation fueled various new government programs, the most central being the cementing of welfare programs like Medicare and Medicaid. LBJ's legacy, though, at home would unfortunately be carried by the Vietnam War, which domestically was seen throughout the late 60s and 70s as a needless, costly, and brutal foreign entanglement that America had no reason to continue fighting. There was no sort of real reason people felt as to why the war was being fought, and so there were increased protests and even the rise of a counterculture movement that generally questioned government authority and the lives that they were supposed to lead. There was the outcropping of the hippie movement, of course, the Summer of Love in 1967, and the famous Woodstock Festival. And so in general, information like this and sort of calling to light the greater political and cultural landscape of any of these time periods is sort of crucial to establishing that contextualization that will be needed regardless of what the prompt specifically will be when it is time to write the DBQ.
Yeah, so like the last few slides were about the context, sort of background information you put in your first paragraph. These next couple of slides will be geared more towards specific examples that you can provide for each of the topics that are most likely to come up. So you see here I put a star by the civil rights movement. I think that the civil rights movement is the most likely topic for this prompt. I wrote several court cases here: Shelley v. Kramer, Brown v. Board of Education. Brown v. Board of Education is really the most critical court cases, though you might remember others like Loving v. Virginia, Painter v. Sweat. But I think Brown v. Board of Ed is the most important to know. The Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington are also very important, so I've provided some information about them here. You can read. There's the Greensboro sit-ins. Sit-ins at Woolworth were the most famous. That was a southern department store that had segregated lunch counters. There were many protests against their policies. Another famous incident is the Little Rock Nine, which were 9 black children who had to be escorted with federal guards to enter the all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. You've probably also heard of Freedom Riders, riding from the north into the segregated South to end segregation in bus facilities. And the more legislation during this age were Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. Obviously this didn't create the amount of immediate change that it needed to, but the legislation is still good to know. So, oh, it's just crashed. Alright, I think it's good now. So while I think this is more the most likely to show up, there's also McCarthyism in Vietnam. These two aren't necessarily the same thing, right? But I just put them both on the slide to save space. During Vietnam, what's critical is not the war necessarily, but American student demonstrations. There was a lot of frustration, for example, at My Lai. Probably if you get a DBQ about this, it won't be asking you to analyze the incident itself, the massacre itself, but about the student demonstrations at home. The most famous student demonstration is at Kent State University in Ohio, where the National Guard fired into the anti-war protest. And the Pentagon Papers were one of the ultimate things that turned public opinion against the war. While this is slightly outside of the time frame, I still think the Pentagon Papers are important. It's an extra outside information that you can provide. And then McCarthyism. McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin who was staunchly anti-communist and essentially hunted down communists in Congress and in the media and elsewhere. So communists began to hunt down with anti-sedition measures, which were prompted by the Smith Act of 1940. And then in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act outlawed all union shops, which are shops where every worker is required to be a member of the union, and essentially weakened unions, making them liable for damages and requiring union leaders to take a non-communist oath. And the third potential issue is social justice. There are a number of issues surrounding this. There's second wave feminism. You can mention Roe v. Wade, even though it's slightly out of the time frame. You can mention The Feminine Mystique, which is a famous book in the movement. There's environmentalism, Silent Spring. Ben mentioned counterculture movement. So out of all these, I think the most likely you are to get is second wave feminism. So it might be good to keep Roe v. Wade and maybe a few other facts about it in mind. But otherwise, I think that probably the most likely to show up on this DBQ tomorrow is the civil rights movement. Alright, does anyone want to ask questions before we end off this video? Alright, I'm gonna cut it here though. Thank you for showing up.